Once again, it's nice to be here and see all of your bright, shining, and smiling faces, and of course, all of those watching online. Some people like to tune in just for the homily, and to them I say, "Hi, Monsignor." You think I'm joking. Today I want to talk not so much about the readings, but I want to talk about a saint. Yesterday was his feast day, the great St. Thomas Aquinas. You guys familiar with St. Thomas Aquinas? I'll tell you a little bit about him. He lived in the 13th century. He died in the year 1274. Yes, that's the 13th century. And he's best known probably to most people for his love of the Eucharist. Whether we talk about it or not as explicitly, but many of you are familiar with the devotion of Eucharistic adoration, such as with the Corpus Christi procession we have. In fact, the entire Mass of Corpus Christi was penned by St. Thomas Aquinas at the request of the Pope. And that famous hymn that we sing, the Pange Lingua, which ends with the Tantum Ergo, that's St. Thomas Aquinas. That he was a man of deep personal love of the sacrament that we gather on Sunday to celebrate here on this altar. The sacrament which waits for us in the tabernacle. That he would often spend long time in prayer in the chapel in front of the cross and the Blessed Sacrament. I want to talk about something he's not necessarily as well known for. He was, of course, a very brilliant academic. And one of his lifelong opponents was a guy by the name of Siger of Brant. He obviously wasn't as popular as St. Thomas Aquinas because you've never heard of him. But this was the age of the birth of what we know today as science. St. Thomas Aquinas, one of his teachers, is St. Albert the Great. He's called the Universal Doctor because St. Albert the Great was a scientist. He sought to find knowledge in all things. Before this time, science was a subset of philosophy. Aristotle did science, for example, and we think of him as the great philosopher. So science was in its birth as its own independent field. This is where we get to the point. Siger recognized that there was a bit of an issue beginning to happen. Namely, that they were discovering things in the natural world, in the sciences, that they couldn't quite make sense of based upon what their faith had been telling them. Not doctrinally, but in all of the theology that had been built up over time. And it's obviously caused some confusion. What do we do with this? How do we bring faith and reason together? Is it possible to do so? And Siger believed that there was such a thing as scientific truth and such a thing as theological truth, and that the two of them could contradict each other. And that was fine with him. So I could scientifically believe this one thing, but theologically, religiously believe the exact opposite, and I didn't have a problem with that. Thomas Aquinas had a problem with that. He said that's impossible. Because God created the whole world, the entire universe in all its order, and he made it according to his own plan. And if there was one God who revealed himself to us in the scripture, who revealed himself to us in the person of his Son upon the cross, and he's the same one that made the universe, then even creation, the truths we find in science, point the way back to God. That there cannot be contradictory truths. Truth must be one. Truth must be one thing. I'm a little academic for you for a reason today. Because Thomas won the argument of the day. but it's a problem that we still see so often. Faith and reason. We have people today who think that faith trumps reason, that faith is prior, and that reason cannot be reconciled with it. Radicals, fundamentalists, Christian, Islamic, Hindu, whatever. That faith is absolute, and that reason has no bearing on it. Faith is absolute, but reason goes with it, because God gave us that faculty. And then you have people on the other side that say, oh, faith, that's just a bunch of stories that we tell our children. Science is where it's really at. And we discover truth, and science can teach us everything. No, it can't. Science can only teach you about the physical world. I said there's a reason science and philosophy parted ways. It was because the field was too expansive. Science can't operate purely independently. So you get some of these scientists that try to make grandiose claims about how God doesn't exist, and it doesn't make sense. They have no argument for it. They believe there's no room for faith in scientific thought. It comes down to us today as the problem that Pope Benedict referred to as relativism. Relativism. That there is a truth that I believe is the truth, and my truth can be different from your truth. And we see this all the time. Maybe somebody comes up to us and tries to convince us of something, and maybe it's us, maybe it's them, won't listen to facts, won't listen to reason, won't listen to evidence, but they're already convinced that they know the truth, and they won't be open to new ideas. And then there's people who, especially in the moral realm, will say that I know what's best for me and nobody can tell me otherwise. That subtly denies that there's a God who created the human race, that we're here to help one another. There's a lady in my parish, a few months back, who was suffering from an addiction to alcohol in particular. And one day I was talking to her on the phone, and she had a couple bottles of hard liquor by this point, and she had convinced herself that the only way she could behave normally was if she was drinking the way that she had been drinking. And she told me that maybe it's true for everybody else that alcohol's bad for you, but for me it's good. How wrong that is. And yet, look, she convinced herself of relativism. Why do I tell you all this today as we talk about St. Thomas Aquinas? Because we also remember that this is Catholic Schools Week. One of the great things that we have as Catholics is a love of education. You know, how many of you have went to university? Or you know somebody that has. Universities were created by the Catholic Church. Long before there was such a thing as public education, we started universities, and then we had religious orders go out and start teaching the grammar age children. Long before there was such a thing as public school. Catholic education is a deep part of who we are, because we believe, as St. Thomas Aquinas did, that truth leads us to God. That truth leads us back to God. Whether it's scientific truth or mathematical truth or religious faith, that truth leads us back to God. I'll give you a famous one, scientific one. The theory of evolution describes how life came to be. Scripture is analogous. We always know that. And we have people today that think that theory of evolution and Scripture are completely incompatible. They are if you take Scripture absolutely literally, but there's levels that you can't. Scripture is always meant to be analogous. It tells us how by faith we approach God. In fact, when Charles Darwin first discovered the theory of evolution, he thought it was great proof of the existence of God because he has a plan and he has an order for creation. Now, eventually he abandoned the idea, but he thought it was a proof of God, a proof of his existence and action in the world even now. We have Catholic schools not because there's nothing else that will teach us science and math. We have Catholic schools because in our Catholic schools we get the bigger picture. That we don't learn science merely for the sake of science. And we don't have science merely for the sake of improving the human condition, but that our love and our desire following math and science and literature ultimately helps to serve leading us to the truth, leading us to the one who is truth himself. St. Thomas Aquinas knew this well. He was a great scholar of his time. He is someone we still read even 800 years later. The Dominican order practically has to have doctorates in St. Thomas Aquinas himself. And St. Thomas Aquinas, if he were standing here today, he would tell us the importance of study, not just of studying books, but that he would say his first and most important classroom, the one he studied in every day, was in that chapel in whatever monastery he was in, that he would come before the altar, before the cross, and before the Blessed Sacrament, and he would say to the Lord, I want to know you. I want to learn about you and follow you. In all of these areas of study, help me find you. So he's one of the patron saints of students. Towards the end of his life, St. Thomas Aquinas, who knew humility, who was truly poor in spirit, as the scripture exhorts us to be, he had a vision of the Lord. And the Lord asked him, what do you want, Thomas? Name anything and I'll give it to you. And St. Thomas Aquinas said to him, I want nothing but you, O Lord. That's the heart of Catholic education. That's the heart of our Catholic schools and the reason we celebrate Catholic Schools Week. That in all things, we discover truth. We grow as humans, as Christians, and we grow as authentic disciples of Christ. It's not something that is simply guaranteed because your kids are in Catholic school. It's something that must be lived every moment of our lives, something that must be practiced at home, something that must be practiced in the parking lot, at the playground. It must be something practiced here every Sunday. You're in school right now, so am I. You might think I'm teaching, I'm learning. But we come into the same classroom St. Thomas Aquinas was in, seeking to know not just truth, but the one who is truth himself, the one who is the author of truth. Catholic education is holistic. Catholic education incorporates faith and reason and unites the two together and has one learn from the other and vice versa, so that we can come to know the truth of the world around us, the truth of the human condition, and the truth of the God who has loved us and given himself up for us. So as we turn to come before this altar, to come to receive the Blessed Eucharist, the Lord asks us what we want. And we come with all our prayers and petitions, but let our first be, nothing but you, O Lord. I want to know you. I want to follow you. I want you to live in me, to live in my heart.